Hello, welcome to our presentation, The Metaphysics of Online Herd Behavior. Welcome from myself, Tommaso Ostillio from Kuzminski University and the University of Warsaw in Poland, from my colleague Pietro Ingallina from the University of Catania and the University of Groningen, and from my colleague Giulio Sciacca from the University of Genoa and Fino Consortium. This is our plan for today. So loosely speaking, we're going to first speak about online herd behavior. So we're going to provide some definition of what this is. Later, we're going to provide some examples of what we mean by online herd behavior in the context of our work. And eventually, we're going to talk about more metaphysics-related topics. And at the very end of the presentation, we're going to provide you with some concluding remarks. And we hope that these remarks can open interesting discussion after our presentation. So we believe that it's best to begin our presentation by referring to the work of French philosopher Pierre Lévy, who in 1994 produced the first anthropology of the cyberspace. Well, in his work, Lévy sees the internet as an enabler of meaningful social aggregation. And in particular, he introduces this concept, the concept of collective intelligence, which refers to the fact that online communities allow people to pool competencies and knowledge to solve shared problems. So this is the idea that people can gather together online and somehow share their knowledge and their competencies in order to find solutions to problems that affect all the members of the community. At the same time, about 10 years after the work of Lévy, American sociologist Henry Jenkins has introduced the concept of convergence culture. And this concept refers to the fact that new media allow people to become independent producers of content, like, for example, YouTube users. And also, it allows people to interact with broadcasters directly and to influence the production of content on broadcasters' end. And one thing that is very important is that Jenkins finds some concrete examples of collecting intelligence that is actualized. And this is, for example, the case of online fandoms. And in particular, he refers to the case of the online fandom of the TV show Survivor in the United States. And this online fandom of Survivor managed to find out who would be the winner of Survivor before the show even ended. Well, this is very interesting and this is very encouraging. But if we think of recent political situations in many countries, we also know that the internet in the last years has also shown its dark sides. And in particular, we find some cases where the opposite of collective intelligence is actualized. And this is what we call herding, so to say. And there are two main forms of herding, in our opinion. And this is also what we find in the most recent literature. So the first case is the first form of herding is the fact that people who are exposed to the same biased information cascades come to have the same wrong beliefs, and this is one. And the second is the fact that these people, so these groups of people who share wrong beliefs, they also consume online content, biased content, and critically. So they do what sociologists would call scriptural inference. So basically, they take this as an unquestionable truth. And at the same time, they are selectively exposed to this content. That means that they see only this kind of content, and this is the only content they want to see. Well, following this discussion, then we should distinguish, let's say, between standard groups and polarized groups. So standard groups, on the one hand, are the groups of individuals that feature forms of intentional and rational agreement amongst their members. So this would be, for example, the case of online fandoms, that they pursue some kind of goal, and they do this on a kind of rational basis. But at the same time, we also have polarized groups, and these are groups that are the direct results of forms of online herding. So these groups basically are the outcome of the fact that people are selectively exposed to biased content, and they're also the outcome of the fact that people who are exposed for too long to biased information cascades, they come to operate what is called scriptural inference. And now, in our account of online communities, so we take online communities as social groups, and in particular, we propose that online communities, they feature three main elements, and the first element is the individual behavior of their members, so the behavior of the individuals who are part of these groups. Second is the interaction between individuals, so the interaction between group members. And then eventually we can consider the whole community as being the result of point 1 and 2. And in particular, one thing that we think is very important is the fact that selective exposure and scriptural inference from biased information cascades affect the behavior of the members of the online communities in the long term.
In this section, we are going to present some cases of polarized groups which emerge out of herd behavior and online discussions. These examples are provided by politics, especially by the rise of new populist parties across Europe. We shall mention here the Italian cases of the Five Star Movement and the League Salvini Premier, Movimento 5 Stelle and Lega Party. And here it is immediately worth noticing that these two Italian parties have inspired the communication agenda of the two main populist Spanish parties, Podemos and Vox. Here we must say that populists bet on fake news has two looping negative side effects. First, it helps populist leaders generating consensus by establishing themselves as cognitive authorities and reliable source of information. Second, it fosters their behavior among supporters and like-minded people. In this regard, updated related examples are the one of the anti-establishment and conspiracy theorist movements Orange Giulio and Movement for the Freedom of Choice. Moving forward, another case is the one of groups that originated from WhatsApp discussions. So during the lockdown, in many Italian towns, people gathered in chats and social media groups to share personal data, pictures, and information about alleged infected people in their area. They wanted to report the deviant behavior of infectors to fellow citizens and authorities. Basically, those people were aiming at protecting themselves against infected people, and they were also demanding safety first over the Constitution, over personal freedom, and over civil rights. Going outside from Europe and Italy, another case is the one of the town of Coeur d'Alene in Idaho. Inhabitants of Coeur d'Alene heard rumors that the same who instigated violence during the Black Lives demonstration in Spokane, Washington, came to the town as well. Thus, people of Coeur d'Alene organized a local militia to patrol the downtown during the Black Lives demonstrations. Inspired by Trump tweets, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, they were protecting buildings and stores from Antifa vandalization, and, why not, eventually shooting some looters too. Last but not least, we have the examples of the Dutch 5G conspiracy theorists, who organized several demonstrations, and since April, they set on fire around 30 cell phones masts. The same actually happened in the UK, with 77 masts burned. Moreover, the movement Stop 5G Netherlands is actually suing the state to stop the introduction of 5G technology in the country. The first attempt was unsuccessful. Why they're doing so? Well, basically because they believe that 5G is used to spread coronavirus among people.
Now consider that one of the main processes characterizing polarized groups is the reinforcement of polarization in the presence of an outgroup, that is, a distinct group of people entertaining radically different beliefs. Particularly, polarization dramatically increases when a group can define itself as contrasting with another. When a group recognizes the existence of an outgroup that classifies and ideologically contrasted in a specific way, its members change in their practices. In the case we are dealing with, these practices are primarily epistemic. Individuals modify their beliefs, resulting in a skewed epistemic cluster of beliefs associated with the group. This phenomenon is not new to social ontology. It was recognized by Jan Hacking, who called it the looping effect. It is a two-step process involving classes of phenomena and their classification. Hacking's classic example concerns child abuse. In the first step, someone introduces the category of child abusers, whose extension is determined as including specific human beings on the basis of their behavior. In the second step, some instances of the category reject the label they are associated with. Consequently, they modify their behavior in order not to fit the category anymore. As a result, the category extension turned out to be modified too. Hacking considers looping effect to be the very mark of social kinds, thus characterizing social taxonomies as intrinsically interactive. Cases of looping effect determine changes in the extensions of some kinds from within. These changes are grounded in the intentions and attitudes of human beings who are classified under specific labels. Therefore, if the looping effect is the distinctive mark of social kinds and polarized groups are subjected to looping effects, then polarized groups are social kinds as well. However, there are natural kinds which exhibit the interactivity associated with looping effects too. In a nutshell, looping effects consist of members of a kind changing with respect to their relevant properties due to human intentions and attitudes toward the kind itself. Such a phenomenon holds for certain natural kinds too. It is enough here to take into consideration a charismatic natural kind, such as the biological species Canis familiaris. Humans artificially selected dogs through generation to tame them and improve their socio-cognitive abilities. Since ancient times, humans have selected many different breeds for different purposes, so that now there are companion dogs, sheepdogs, guard dogs, and so forth. Therefore, the natural kind Canis familiaris changes with respect to many relevant properties under the pressure of artificial selection, which eventually means in response to human intentions. Thus, if natural kinds exhibit looping effects too, looping effect cannot be considered the mark of social kinds. Anyway, there are further grounds to argue that polarized groups are social kinds. As pointed out by Khalidi, a condition which must be satisfied by social kinds is mind sustenance of their instances. This condition amounts to the continuous presence of specific human attitudes and behavior towards them. The persistence of a social kind and its instances, qua instances of that social kind, is thus grounded in specific human dispositions towards the social kind itself. For example, consider the social kind $10 banknote. The kind does not go out of existence as long as human agents entertain specific attitudes and behaviors about specific scraps of paper. In the case of polarized groups, mind sustenance holds from within groups themselves, in that specific attitudes and behavior are self-directed. Group members actively recognize themselves as members of such groups. That is, people roughly sharing the claims, no matter how extreme or absurd they are, associated with the group, identify themselves as members of a polarized group. The sustenance of the group thus depends on the sustenance of its instances. In turn, this latter is grounded in group members recognizing themselves as such. When people no longer recognize themselves as members of a polarized group, they exit the group. This, when members of polarized groups cannot stand the claims of the group anymore, for example, because claiming themselves has become too extreme, they can choose to leave the group. This phenomenon shows that mind sustenance of polarized group is not a trivial phenomenon at all, being the result of intentional human behaviors. Moreover, there are two specific classificatory effects that social kinds, but not other interactive kinds, undergo. The behavior of instances of social kinds and the behavior of people towards them can be affected in two specific ways, both grounded in the fact that instances of such kinds do not need to instantiate every property of the cluster associated with the kind they belong. These are mistaken attributions and faking of actions. There is a case of mistaken attribution of intentions. An animal rights group is formed and quickly polarized. Its members start using a violent language towards kennels they repute to take insufficient care of dogs. Successively, its members start violently picketing inside such kennels. One day, Anna sees her friend Maria entering a structure known for not treating animals properly. Since Anna knows Maria to be a member of the animal rights group, she predicts an imminent picket. However, Maria entered the kennels just to leave an informative flyer on vivisection. It happens that Maria is a member of the animal rights group, only that she is not an extremist member and refuses the violent turn the group took. Hence, by predicting that Maria entered the kennel qua both a member of the animal rights group and a violent protester, Anna offered a wrong explanation of Maria's intentions and actions. Moreover, consider also that Maria could act deceitfully to preserve its membership. For example, it could be the case that Maria is a suppressed voice in the animal rights group as a woman in a mixed gender group. She still recognizes herself as a member of the group and supports many of its battles, but she rejects the violent aspects thereof. However, in order to preserve her membership and contribute to its internal debate, she could fake her believing in some of the extremist epistemic properties associated with the group, when in fact she does not. Therefore, polarized groups not only enjoy mind sustenance, but they are also subjected to the same classificatory effect that are typically associated with social kinds. Hence, there are good reasons to conclude that polarized groups should be considered social kinds. Moreover, they do not seem to be characterized by essential properties, but rather by co-current and largely predictable beliefs instantiated by their members. Which kind of scientific kinds fit polarized groups better? It is a minimal notion of scientific kinds which will make sense of the patterns of instantiation of beliefs in polarized groups without committing to unnecessary metaphysical assumptions. It is possible to draw from the epistemic conception of natural kinds whose honorable genesis dates back to Mill, Russell, and Quine. According to any epistemic conception of natural kinds, the theoretical role associated with natural kinds is first and foremost to ground in scientific inductive inferences and generalization. Henceforth, natural kinds are given a minimal metaphysical account as collection of objects instantiating scientifically relevant properties. Such an approach has been recently revitalized and improved by Khalidi, Ereshefsky, and Raydon and Slater. We will follow the latter in delineating our account of polarized groups. Slater develops a stable property cluster account of natural kindness. Accordingly, natural kindness is a condition which comes in degree, and it does not constitute an ontological category. Note also that it is not a concern to model social kinds employing an account of natural kinds. Epistemically conceived, natural kinds are just collection of objects instantiating scientifically relevant properties. What matters then is that the properties associated with the kind are explanatory and ground inductive inferences, and this is undoubtedly the case with polarized groups. Moreover, natural kindness is a condition dependent on a specific sort of robustness, namely cliquish stability. Cliquish stability is a property of property clusters. Given a cluster of property, the members of the cluster are cliquish stable if the instantiation of the properties in some subcluster robustly guarantees the instantiation of the remaining members. That is, given a scientific context and a set of relevant counterfactual conditions, the co-instantiation of those properties is guaranteed. The relevance threshold for counterfactual condition is determined by the specific context of explanation of the science, which makes use of the kind. With a proper metaphysical characterization of polarized groups. First, polarized groups are social groups. However, philosophers have not reached a consensus on the metaphysical of social groups yet. If natural kindness is just a status that any sort of entity might have to some degree, the fact that polarized groups are natural kinds does not impose any restriction on a metaphysical characterization of them. Second, the fact that it is possible to make sense of degrees of naturalness is coherent with the structure of some polarized groups and the mechanisms they can undergo. For example, the phenomenon of depolarization. Groups show a higher degree of polarization when the members deal with questions of highly visible public interest, such as, shall we stop buying cars? However, they depolarize if they have to cope with precise and widely unknown matters of fact, such as, how many teeth do horses have? A prediction we can do based on depolarization is that groups interested in both kinds of questions will manifest deep polarization for the former, but scarce or no polarization at all for the latter. As the property cluster associated with such groups will generally be more limited than that associated with groups discussing just polarizing questions. Therefore, some polarized groups turn out to be more epistemically natural than others. The property cluster associated with polarized groups consists of epistemic properties, particularly belief, which are robustly instantiated by the members of the groups. Moreover, the stable property cluster account is silent about the mechanism grounding cliquish stability associated with kinds. Such agnosticism is a virtue of the accounts which fits polarized group well, since it is compatible with the fact that there are different, yet not necessarily mutually exclusive phenomena which can ground their kindness. For example, Sunstein distinguishes between the limited argument pool theory, the corroboration theory, and the social comparison theory. These three theories explain the formation of polarized groups through different social and psychological processes and mechanisms. According to Ricci, type 1 groups feature complexes of social relation between group members, and examples are the division of roles in football teams or management boards, whereas the main hallmark of type 2 groups is that group members share essential socially constructed properties, as is the case of ethnicity or gender. One could ask why she should consider polarized groups as a third category of groups, thus different from type 1 and type 2 groups. The distinction between type 1 and polarized groups is easily spelled out. Type 1 groups are identified through their non-trivial organized structure, whereas polarized groups are neither necessary structure instantiating. Of course, one and the same group can be both type 1 and type 3 at the same time. However, it would have different identity conditions when considered qua type 1 group and qua type 3 group. Identity conditions for polarized groups must primarily rely on their associated cluster of beliefs. In comparison, the difference between polarized and type 2 group is more subtle. As Richie points out, type 2 groups are socially constructed kinds, in that having specific natural properties ensures that a person counts as an F in a context C. We argue above that polarized groups are mind-sustained, and mind sustenance qualifies as a kind of social construction too. Nevertheless, there is a crucial difference between the two kinds of social construction. In polarized groups, mind sustenance all just from within groups itself, in that their members actively recognize as such and do not exit the group they belong to. Differently, this kind of continual social construction is not necessary for the persistence of type 2 groups. Consider OMB race classification. According to it, for example, native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander constitute a human race. Now, it is undoubtedly the case that very few people who belong to this category actively recognize themselves as such. Anyway, they still are members of it, since they satisfy its defining properties. In other words, propositional attitudes for the group themselves towards themselves are necessary for the persistence of polarized groups, but not for the persistence of type 2 groups. So, to conclude, we state that online communities and polarized groups are nowadays a very interesting case for investigation across the social sciences. Besides, these social groups deserve the attention of social ontologists. We said also that social groups undergo genuine looping effects, as is the case of Allen cases. Moreover, these groups are not type 1 or type 2 groups. Hence, these groups are a new type of social groups, which we call type 3 groups. To conclude, we state also that type 3 groups should be identified with SPCK, and we state some characterization of them. And so, thank you for your time.